Hello and welcome. In previous video I told you about the keys in SQL. In this video I will tell you about the constraints in SQL. So let's just dive into the topic. Now what are constraints? Constraints are basically some limitations, restrictions or conditions that we apply to our database so that the user who is accessing our database will access the data according to those conditions, right? Now there are four types of constraints in SQL. These are unique, not null, primary key and foreign key. So let's just see what are these constraints and how do these constraints work. Starting off with the unique constraint. As its name says that the data has to be unique. Data added within the column cannot be duplicated. It has to be different. It has to be unique from other values that are added within the column. For example, our national identity number. Two people can't have the same identity number, so we will apply this constraint to our national identity number. Similarly, our phone number, our emails, the attributes that cannot be same for more than one people will fall under the unique constraint, right? Now here are some queries through which we can add the constraint into our database. So starting off with how we can add this constraint during the creation of our table, right? Now the first one is create table xyz id int unique name varchar 100. Now what we are doing here, we are writing the unique keyword with the id, right? We are giving this constraint to the attribute id, means that id will not be same for more than one people, right? Two people will not have the same id, they will have the different id. Similarly, create table xyz name varchar and unique id, right? Now what we are doing here, we are writing the keyword unique and id within the brackets, right? Now this we are doing in the end, we are writing the unique constraint in the end, right? Similarly, id int name varchar constraint name and then the unique id. Now what we are doing here, we are writing the keyword constraint, then the name of that constraint and which constraint do we want to apply and where do we want to apply that constraint, right? Now what we are doing here, we are writing constraint, then the name of constraint, then the unique constraint that is to be applied on the id column, right? Now similarly, two people won't have the same id, id will be different for each entry that is given inside our database. Now here are some queries through which we can add the unique constraint on alter table. Now what is alter table? Alter table is basically the process through which we modify or update our existing table, right? We alter our existing table. So the first query is alter table xyz add unique id. Now what we are doing is we are altering the table, we are modifying the table xyz and we are adding the unique constraint to the id, right? Similarly, the second query is alter table xyz add constraint name and the unique id. So what we are doing here, we are writing the keyword constraint, then the name of that constraint, what constraint and where do we want to apply. So what we are doing here, we are writing the constraint name and then the unique constraint and we want to apply it on our id, right? Now how we can drop the unique constraint? So we can drop the unique constraint by simply writing alter table xyz drop constraint then the name of constraint, right? We will write the name of the constraint, right? The name that we have given to our constraint we will write here, then it will drop the constraint. Now not null constraint. The not null constraint does not let us to add any null value within our database, right? It won't allow us to leave any column empty, right? Now one thing important to notice over here is that many people confuse null with zero, which is totally wrong. 0 is not null. 0 is a value itself, right? Not a null means to leave it empty, not to write anything. And not null constraint will not allow us to leave any column empty, right? Now here are the syntaxes through which we can add the not null constraint into our database. So how we can add not null constraint into our database? We simply have to write create table id int not null name varchar not null age int not null, right? Or here what we are doing, we are giving this constraint to our id name and age. Now we will have to write a value within these columns, right? We can't leave id name add the age null, we can't leave it empty, we will have to write something, it will not allow us to leave it empty, right? Similarly, how we can add this constraint on our alter table query? So we will have to write alter table abc alter column id int not null. Now what we are doing here, we are writing alter table and then the column of that table, right? We are now altering the column id. What we are doing, we are giving the not null constraint to our column id, right? So it will not let us leave id column empty. Now moving on to the primary key constraint. The primary key, as I told you in my previous video, is a column that uniquely identifies each row within the table, right? Now here are two features of the primary key. The first one is that it should not be a null value. It should not be left empty. There should be a value within that column, right? And the second one is it should be unique. Two rows will not have the same value for the primary key. They should be unique, they should be different. Now here are some syntaxes through which we can add the primary key constraint into our database. So how we can do it during the creation of our table? So the first query is create table ABC ID name age then primary key and ID within the brackets, right? Now what we are doing over here is we are writing the keyword primary key, the constraint in the end, and then on which column do we want to apply. Over here we are giving the ID, so the ID will act as a primary key column for the table ABC, right? Now the second query is create table ABC ID primary key name and then age, right? Now what we are doing here, now we are specifying the constraint with the column. Now here we are writing ID primary key, means that ID will be the primary key, and we are doing it with the column where we want to apply that constraint, right? Now the third one is create table ABC int ID name age and then the constraint's name, then which constraint do you want to apply and then on which column do you want to apply. So what we are doing over here is we are writing the keyword constraint, then the name for that constraint, and then the primary key, and we want to apply the primary key on our ID, right? Now how we can add the primary key on alter table query? Simply we have to write alter table ABC then add primary key ID. Now what we are doing here is that we are writing the keyword add and then the constraint, that is the primary key, and then the column within the parenthesis, that is the ID. So what we are doing here is that we are giving the primary key constraint to the column ID, right? The second query is alter table ABC then add constraint name, then the constraint that we want to apply, and then on which column do we want to apply that constraint. So what we are doing over here is we are writing the keyword add, then the keyword constraint, then the name of constraint, then the primary key, and we want to apply that primary key over the column ID, right? Now how we can drop the primary key constraint on our database? So how we can do that? We simply have to write alter table ABC drop primary key. Now what we are doing here is simply that we are saying we want to drop the primary key, right? Or we can write alter table ABC drop constraint pkid. Now what we are doing here is we are giving the name of that constraint, that is pkid, that is the primary key ID. We have given the name to that constraint, right? Now we are dropping the constraint through that name. Now the foreign key constraint. The foreign key, I also told you in my previous video, these are the columns which refer to the primary key of another table, right? These columns refer to the primary key of their parent columns, right? Now here are some syntaxes through which we can add the foreign key into our database. Now how we can do that during the creation of our database? The first query says create table courses, then the ID, that is primary key, course name, that is not a null, then the student ID, then we are writing the keyword foreign ID, then referencing the table to which we are referencing and the column of that table, the column of its parent table, right? Now what we are doing over here is we are writing this column student ID and we are giving it the foreign key constraint, and then we are referring to the table student ID and then the column as ID of that table, right? And the second query, it says create table course ID, then the name, then the student ID, then the primary key constraint that we have applied to the CID column, right? And then the foreign key constraint that we have applied to the student ID, that is referencing to the table students and SID column of that table, right? Now the students is the parent table and the SID is the column from that table, right? Now it is referencing to the students table and SID of the students table. Now the third one is create table courses, course ID, the name, the student ID. Then what we are doing, we are writing the keyword constraint, then FKSID foreign key student ID, that is referencing to the students table and then the SID of that table, right? Now how we can add this foreign key constraint on our alter table queries? So what we are gonna do is we're simply gonna write alter table courses add foreign key SID referencing to the students and the student's ID. Now what we are doing over here is we are giving the constraint to the SID and from which table it is referencing and what column on that table it is referencing, right? Now what we are doing here is we are adding the foreign key constraint to the SID column of the table courses and we are referencing to the table students and the student ID of that table, right? Now the second one is alter table courses add constraint FKSID foreign key SID referencing to the student ID, sorry, right? Now what we are doing over here is we are writing the add keyword, then the constraint keyword, then the name of that constraint and what constraint do we want to apply. We want to apply foreign key over here on what column, on column SID on and from which table are we referencing to. We are referencing to the students table and what column of that table, that is the student ID, right? Now how we can drop the foreign key constraint, we simply have to write alter table courses drop foreign key FKSID. Now what we are doing over here is we are giving the constraint that is foreign key and the name of that constraint that is FKSID, right? Similarly what we can do is we can write alter table courses drop constraint FKSID. Now over here we don't have to write the constraint, we are writing the name of that constraint that is FKSID. Now I hope you guys understood. If you did understood, please give it a thumbs up. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.